Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of the opium trade and how it had fueled the development of capitalism over the centuries and how it still serves as a fuel today. My guest for this conversation is renowned writer and novelist Amitav Ghosh. Amitav Ghosh has written a number of books, both novels and nonfiction. His latest book is a book of nonfiction that's very much about this history that we're going to be talking about today. It is called Smoke and Ashes. Amitav Ghosh, it is my good pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Thank you very much for having me again.
Can we begin by talking about the plant itself that opium comes from? This is the poppy seed. What do you think is important to know about this plant?
One of the things that's important to know about this plant, which is Papaver somniferum, is that it doesn't exist in the wild. Even though humans have cultivated the opium poppy for maybe as much as 10,000 years, this plant doesn't grow in the wild. It's actually a cultivar that humans developed precisely to sort of concentrate its various powers and so on, and its various, it has so many things that it can do. So I guess, it's absolutely, opium is in many ways an absolutely miraculous substance. It remains to this day, the strongest of anesthetics. It also works for antidiarrheals. It works as a cough syrup. So opium has many properties, but it's kind of important to know that these properties evolved symbiotically with us as humans. I mean, people just cultivated it in various ways to actually cultivate these properties.
That's interesting. And so you could use. So I think of opium as a painkiller. But you can use it for many things, and people over time have used it for many things.
Yes, opium is a very powerful painkiller. But the thing about opium is that the kind of pain that it kills is not just physical pain. It can also alleviate, many kinds of psychological problems, just grief and so on. So that's another aspect of opium, which is really kind of amazing. At the same time, the problem with it, with opium, really, is that it's incredibly addictive. So it's very easy to become addicted to that alleviation of pain, no matter whether it's physical or psychological. And that's how really opium creates these epidemics of addiction. And these epidemics are in many ways strangely similar over time.
Where do we first find evidence of the use of opium?
As far as I know, but again, this is speculative because archaeologists find new things every day. But as far as I know, there's a 6,000-year-old Neolithic site in Switzerland where they found evidence of opium. But, opium was widely known to the ancient Egyptians, to the Greeks. They knew of all its properties. Pliny, the great Roman author, he wrote about opium. There are papyruses that, talk about opium. So opium was very widely known across civilizations, across the entirety of, Eurasia and Africa. Opium was known to people. And that's not surprising because opium even today is used in a surprising variety of medications. If you look at your shelf of over-the-counter medicines, and if you look carefully at the ingredients, you will be surprised by how many of these medications contain opium. I mean, for example, if you've ever taken an antidiarrheal, it's very likely that it has some traces of opium in it. Similarly, many cough syrups have opium in them, and of course, even now, opium. Many anesthetics are fundamentally opioids. So, this opium has such a wide range of uses that before modern times, it was absolutely the most important medicinal substance known to man. And pharmacists and apothecaries and so on used opium in many of their concoctions because there was no other substance that was guaranteed to have such an effect upon the human body.
Before we get to sort of the opium trade and its connection to capitalism, tell me a bit more about opium before this period of time. And I guess an important period would be with the Mongolian Empire. What was important to know about opium in the Mongolian Empire?
Well, the thing about opium is that unlike many other psychoactive substances, for example, unlike psilocybin mushrooms or, ayahuasca, or for that matter, marijuana, opium was not a sort of grassroots psychoactive. You couldn't just go out into a field and pick up some opium. Opium is a very highly processed drug and always has been.
So you just
You
couldn't
have
find
to
it.
have
You couldn't find a poppy plant, eat it, and
no.
have the effects of it. Yeah.
Well, it might have some effect, but it would not have the effect of, and it would. You would have to eat it at the precise moment when it produces that gum, and that gum exists only for a period of a few days. So it has to be harvested at exactly that moment. When it's ripe with the opium gum, the latex. So I imagine if you ate an awful lot of that latex, it would probably make you very sick, but it could also have some other effect. But other than that, opium itself as a substance is very highly processed. It used to take as long as a year, to process opium. So this, in a sense, created a kind of natural limit for how much opium could be in circulation at any given time. So, for even though humans have known the opium poppy for a very long time, for most of that time, in fact, the trade in opium, in as much as it existed, was a trade in medicinal opium. But that changed. Opium went through two great periods of historical expansion. One was during the Mongolian Empire, the 13th century till, let's say, the 15th century, because Mongol courts started adopting opium as a sort of psychoactive, as a recreational drug, let's say. But it was confined to the courts, to the very top levels of society. So ordinary people couldn't really, take opium in that way. Then the next great expansion that opium goes through is under the European empires. Once the European empires entered the Indian Ocean, they started using opium as a trade commodity in a very big way. And they used it to try and establish monopolies on all sorts of commodities. And this process continued, from the 16th century onwards. And it was, the Dutch used opium a great deal in the Dutch East Indies, but it was the British that really brought this whole model to perfection, as it were, of a kind of imperial narco state.
We're going to get into that. Tell me more about the Dutch East India Company. Oftentimes when we talk about the history of colonialism, or we even hear the term East India Company, we think of the British East India Company. But the Dutch were oftentimes the precursors of European colonialism.
Very much so. The Dutch were the dominant naval power through most of the 17th century. And it's often forgotten that the Dutch actually defeated the British in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. So the Dutch were the dominant power, naval power, and as soon as they entered the Indian Ocean region, their one ambition was to establish control of the spice trade. The spice trade at that point, it's often forgotten that the most valuable spices came from very remote islands in the Indian Ocean. So cloves, for example, were endemic to a set of five or six islands In the northern Malaccas. The center of the clove trade was an island called Ternate. So these are tiny volcanic islands, but the volcanic ecology created these unbelievable forests that teemed with rarities of all kinds. So the cloves came from that region. And there was another region which produced an incredibly valuable spice, which was the nutmeg. So nutmegs and mace, they grow together. They're part of the same fruit. The nutmeg has a covering, has a lacy covering, which is in fact what mace is. So this was an incredibly valuable commodity. So the Dutch, they reached these islands, which are known as the Banda Islands, which are in the southern part of the Moluccas. They reached these islands around 1600. Actually, I wrote a book about the nutmeg called The Nutmeg's Curse. That was like 2 books ago, I think.
We had that. That's the book we had you on for.
Yes, that's right.
It's all come back to
we
me
talked
now.
About it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
the Banda,
that's right.
I think we named the show the Banda Island Massacre or something like that.
Yes, that's because the Dutch carried out this really kind of appalling genocide in the Banda Islands, where they literally sort of eliminated the entire native population because the population was making trouble for them, as it were. So they just eliminated them. They killed about a third of the population, enslaved a third, starved the others to death. It was just one of those horrifying historic early modern genocides. And the connection there is really the Dutch were in the Banda Islands, and that was one end of their empire. The other end of their empire was where I am right now, which is New Amsterdam,
Yeah.
in New Holland. In fact, the city I'm in right now is Brooklyn.
Brooklyn's a Dutch word.
That's right. So they were fighting these incredible genocidal battles against Native Americans, in this part of the world. And that's the technique that they applied in the Banda Islands. And they and the British, the Dutch and the British were like frenemies. They were very close. They were competitors. And eventually the British placed the Dutchman on their throne, Prince William of Orange and so on. They were very close. They were competitors, but they were also cooperating with each other in various ways. So the British, it's often forgotten that their first possession in the Indian Ocean was not in India. It was actually in the Moluccas. They grabbed one of these nutmeg-producing islands. The island is actually called Pulau Run, and there was an article about it somewhere recently, where they don't credit me, but I'm sure they took a lot of it from me, as happens, Pulau Run, actually the Dutch got the British off it, but they had to exchange it at the Treaty of Breda. So they traded Manhattan for Pulau Run. At that point in time, this tiny little pinprick of an island in the very far east of the Indian Ocean was more valuable than Manhattan, So, this is part of a sort of evolving history of capitalist globalization, as it were.
And this is an important part. You mentioned earlier the Mongolian Empire, and when you really start to see evidence of opium being used as a recreational drug, it's with Western colonialism, first the Dutch and then the British Empire, that it would really start to use it as a form of currency or for trade.
Yes, absolutely. No, it was a form of currency. So what the Dutch would do is that they would go to these various Southeast Asian states, especially in Java and Sumatra, and they would say they would start providing opium to the court. And especially in Southeast Asia, people had no exposure to opium. Addiction happened very, very quickly, filtering downwards from the royal courts and so on. And then the Dutch would trade. Opium was a monopoly for them. So they would provide all the opium. And in exchange for that, these little states would provide them with various commodities that they had. So they used this very effectively. But again, even before the Dutch, the Portuguese were doing this also, but on a very small scale. But all of that came to be dwarfed later. But even the Dutch, in a period of like 70 years in the East Indies, they increased the circulation of opium 17-fold. So they were absolutely instrumental to getting people hooked on opium. I mean, they were just providing this stuff, and people were getting hooked on it. But interesting to note, all their opium actually came from India. So that's the next part of the story.
Why India?
Well, in India, there were two regions which, for a long time, going back centuries, actually cultivated medicinal opium because medicinal opium was a necessary substance that people used. But so one region was in central India, the other was in eastern India, in the state that's now called Bihar. And this state happened to fall into English hands in the mid 17th century, 1760s. And that was where the opium production was mainly based. And as soon as the British conquered this region, they immediately declared a monopoly over opium. And then they expanded opium production hugely over a period of the next 100 years. I mean, if you look at the charts, it's actually kind of shocking. I mean, it's astonishing how much they expanded the production and processing of opium. And by that point, most of this opium was going to Southeast Asia or to China.
When I think about the growing of the poppies and development of the poppy seed, I think of Afghanistan. Is there a reason why I think that, other than news informing me that about that?
No, it's entirely because of the news. Because Afghanistan was not historically one of the major centers of opium production. In fact, even though opium was consumed there by various Mongol dynasties and their scions, most of this opium probably either came from Turkey or from India. So, opium production really took off in Afghanistan in the late 20th century, largely because of all the invasions and so on.
Okay. That's good. That's important to know. So how does, if we really look here at the 19th century, which I think is an important century in the story you tell, we even have two wars called the Opium Wars with China. What do the British do to sort of use opium and in its connection, and I guess the development and part of your argument of capitalism?
So the British economy in this period, 17th century, 18th century, was very closely tied to the Chinese economy, just as it is today again. The British, the financial structure of the British economy was very dependent on the revenue from taxes on Chinese tea, because the consumption of Chinese tea was growing very, very fast in Britain. And the taxes on Chinese tea was one of the highest sources of revenue for the British, and they were in fact completely dependent on it. And tea was traded in Britain and in all the British colonies, like in America as well, as a monopoly of the East India Company. So Americans weren't allowed to trade with China or to trade in tea. That was exclusively the province of the East India Company. And that's, as you know, one of the reasons why there was the Boston Tea Party and so on. So for the British, tea was an absolutely essential commodity. But they had nothing to trade with the Chinese. They didn't produce anything that the Chinese needed. Everything that they produced, the Chinese could produce better, which is, again, a strange historical resonance, In fact, one of the Chinese emperors wrote to King George III and said, we have not the slightest need of your manufactures, So the British had to find something. So they had to buy...
So the British wanted Chinese goods. The Chinese didn't necessarily need British goods or...
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No, they neither needed them nor wanted them. So the Chinese had to buy tea with bullion, basically with silver. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, this was not a problem because there was a lot of silver coming into international trade because of the European seizures of their conquests of the Americas. South America had some of the biggest silver mines in the world, and using slave labor and enslaved indigenous labor, the Spanish worked these people to death and dug out huge quantities of silver, which they then which then found its way into international trade. But by the mid 18th century, this source of silver was drying up. And the British found it increasingly hard to, there was less and less silver available to them because they spent so much of it anyway already on tea. So they needed another commodity to trade with the Chinese. And they had seen what the Dutch did in the Dutch East Indies. And, they just took up that idea and ran with it. Because at this point, opium smoking was slowly being introduced into China because China had connections with Java. There was substantial Chinese populations living in Java. And it was in Java that the Chinese first started smoking opium. Because you have to remember that opium is introduced shortly after tobacco. So with the introduction of tobacco smoking, which caught on very, very fast in China, opium follows on its heels. So before that, no one anywhere smoked opium. People ate or drank opium, no one smoked it. But it's after this, it's sort of around the 1640s that the people in Java start smoking opium, and the Chinese catch that habit. The Chinese emperors and the Chinese bureaucratic system were very well aware of what was going on in Java. They realized that the Dutch were using opium as a kind of instrument, to colonize the East Indies, and they were very aware of this, and they became very defensive in relation to opium. So as early as 1729, the Chinese emperor banned opium. And incidentally, every Southeast Asian state tried to ban opium. It's a strange thing that Europeans later presented opium as a kind of, it was kind of an Asiatic vice. It was Asiatic bodies were needed opium, as it were, in a constitutional sense. But in fact, opium was completely new to Southeast Asia and to China. And that was its precise appeal. This is one of the mysterious things about opioids. They always reappear in a new guise, and they appear exotic, and they're always associated with faraway places. And so this is the strange thing about opium. It constantly reinvents itself, as it were. And it's constantly spinning off new versions of itself. So it went from being something that was drunk or eaten, and it became something that was smoked. This is already a huge sort of quantum leap in addictiveness, and it's always gone on and on from that. So anyway, the long and the short of it is that because of this whole balance of trade issue, the British started exporting more and more opium to China, and then the market just expanded at an incredible rate. And, this is one of the sort of strange myths of capitalism. You have to remember that many of the British opium traders were actually Scotsmen. And they were Scotsmen from Edinburgh, and they had been exposed to Adam Smith's ideas, and they believed very much in all this stuff about, the market equilibrium and the balance of supply and demand. And yet, there they are. So when they force opium on China, the British government forces opium on China after the First Opium War, when it literally, went to war with China to make sure that the Chinese market was kept open for opium. And their argument for this is that there are these ineluctable laws of supply and demand, and if we don't provide the supply, someone else will. But opium is not a normal commodity. Addictive substances in general are not normal commodities. One of the Sacklers is alleged to have said that you don't chase a market, you create it. So, people who deal with these substances, they know that with addictive substances, it's the supply that creates demand. Once you once you make large supplies of these addictive substances available, they create their own markets. And that's exactly what happened with OxyContin. Before 1993, America didn't have an opioid problem. Within 6 years, that was completely reversed. And the same thing happened in China in the 19th century.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the history of the opium trade. Our guest is renowned writer and novelist Amitav Ghosh. His latest book is about this history. It's called Smoke and Ashes. There's some things I want to just unpack with you there because they're so extraordinary. And I also find it incredible. I heard you say in another speech, and when I was preparing for our conversation, that when you think of the effect that opium had on China in the 19th century, you could compare that to the effect that opium is having on the United States today.
Similar. I mean, I would say it's uncannily similar. They say that one of the reasons, well, first of all, if you make a large amount of opium available, it's going to create its own market, and that's what happened in the 18th and 19th century China. And this is exactly what the Sacklers understood, what Purdue Pharma understood, and many other, they are always named, but there are many other companies that were also producing opioids around this time. And they understood that you make a huge supply available and it'll take off. The uncanny thing about it is that in China as well, it was the opium supplies were often directed at people who are habitually in pain, like miners, workers, farmers often. So similarly, the Sacklers quite self-consciously, started selling their opioids in regions of America where there were many miners, many people who'd lost their jobs or whatever, because of industrial blight and so on. So those are exactly the regions where opium was made available. The second uncanny, I mean, there are so many similarities, I couldn't even begin to go through it all. But another thing that happened is that, it's when the Mandarins started using opium that it became a habit that lower classes emulated. This tends to be a pattern with drug use, when you see someone else, someone who has a higher standing in society, as it were, then you want to emulate their things. So often, in fact, that's another pattern that has happened, that has followed in America, because, many of the great artists, and especially the jazz musicians and so on, were the pioneers in opium use in America. Opioid use, I should say. Another strange sort of recurring pattern is that it's often the most trusted people in society who started, as it were, recommending opium. So in China, it was doctors. It was like apothecaries and doctors and so on. Because after all, opium does assuage pain. In the same way, we see in America that, in fact, it was often the doctors were the most trusted people in, let's say, in rural Appalachia. Pharmacists were very much trusted. So the drug companies started literally sort of bribing these people, not literally with money, though sometimes it was also that, but, giving them presents and so on. So, what happens then is that there's a general collapse in trust within the society. And that certainly happened in China in the 19th century. There was a collapse of trust in all kinds of institutions, in the bureaucracy, in the whole imperial system. And you have to remember that until the 18th century, the Chinese were widely regarded, even by Europeans, as having the best system of governance that existed. Yet within 100 years, this trust in Chinese governance completely dissipated. It's remarkable to think, but for example, so many of the institutions of the Chinese state were adopted by Westerners. For example, examinations, for civil services or for anything. It was the Chinese who invented that. So they had these very effective structures of governance at a certain point. I mean, Chinese bureaucracies were incredible, doing censuses, creating archives, incredible amounts of sort of archival material and so on. They were doing that on a scale that matched the Europeans in every way. But then in the 19th century, that trust completely collapses. And now today, because you see your local law enforcement people, they're taking massive bribes from opium traders. You see your doctors, your bureaucrats, all taking these massive bribes from opium traders, and you just completely lose faith in them. And this is what has happened in large parts of America, which I think is something that the coastal elites, especially, just don't understand. And that's one of the reasons why there's so much rage, in Red America. Because, the number of people who died, in a 5 or 6 year period of opioid overdoses starting around about 2008, more people died of opioids than had died in the Second World War, So it was, Americans that had died in the Second World War. So it was a major crisis, and it was experienced as a disaster by people in these rural communities. There's a whole literature about it now, and it's incredibly moving. You see, mothers suddenly don't understand what their children are doing. They don't understand why they're behaving in these ways, why they're stealing from them, and so on. So it's experienced as deep, profound grief. And that's why you have this huge spike in deaths of despair. That occurred around the country, but especially rural parts of the country, in that period. And actually, people thought that opioid use would go down after the pandemic, but in fact, it's continued to surge. And now it's tied to synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which are even more dangerous. So that's another one of the. But most of all, the factor that people point to in relation to China and its opioid crisis in the 19th century was a general collapse of civilizational belief. China till then had thought, as Americans think now, that they were number one. They were the Middle Kingdom. They were the indispensable nation. Everything that was happening around them, they were the center of it all, and everything else was on the peripheries. And I think over the last at least 150 years, Americans have basically adopted that worldview. And now, when we see a completely new multipolar order arising, I think it's deeply disturbing to Americans, and it's psychologically disturbing to them. They don't know how to cope with it, and that's another reason why I think you have. These deaths of despair spiking in such a way.
It's profound. It's incredible to think about coming back to the 19th century and the British, again, demanding trade with China. China saying, well, you don't really have anything we want. So the British then come and force opium onto China, use addiction, I guess, as currency, really. And I've heard both, again, 2 opium wars in the 19th century.
Yes.
I heard both of these were wars for free trade. Do you think that's the correct way to?
Absolutely. That's exactly what they said. These are wars for free trade. That was entirely the justification of it. And of course, those wars of free trade didn't stop. In some sense, the Iraq wars were presented as wars of free trade. Every war that the West has fought against Asia, against Asian powers of various kinds, had this dimension of justification, that it's all about free trade and so on.
And then there are many people who actually made their fortunes because of this, that we still recognize these names today as very wealthy, influential names in common life.
Absolutely. And this is best documented in relation to America, because several American historians have written about this subject, because some of the Americans were very quick to get in on the trade with China. So in 1783, just as independence is occurring, the Americans find that they can't trade with their neighbors, which are all British colonies. So China becomes a lifeline for them.
Yeah, I was surprised to read in your book. We've had a very close trading relationship with China right from the beginning.
Very close.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, it was the imperative to trade with China that really led to many of the voyages of discovery that occur in the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, the Lewis and Clark expedition. One of their remits was to find the easier trading route with China, which they actually did. I mean, they come to the Pacific Ocean and so on, and then John Jacob Astor, he founds his city of Astoria, essentially to trade furs with China. So those early traders, they used to trade furs, ginseng, etc. But what happened is that they also reached a point where they didn't have anything to trade to the Chinese. There was nothing they had that the Chinese wanted. So they again had to resort to opium, because they saw that this is what the British were doing. And they became great pioneers. Americans pioneered the Turkish opium route to China. They found a very profitable source of opium in Turkey. They started carrying opium from Turkey to China. Now, it's important to remember that this was the work of a very small group of interrelated families. Basically, they're the families we now call the Boston Brahmins. They were sort of British descended Protestants, basically New England Yankees. Exactly the people you think of as being so very upright and God fearing and so on. But they basically make the money in the opium trade, and it's a whole list of these families: Cabots, Lodges, Perkinses, Delanos, and so on.
Peabody.
Peabody, yes. Yeah. The Peabody connection was not that great. I mean, they speculated in Joseph Peabody speculated in opium, but the Peabody fortune actually came from, I think, the Peabodys were partners of the J.P. Morgan family, as I remember. But they certainly had their hands in it, to some degree. And today, the best museums of the Asian trade are the Peabody museums, especially the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. So it was this interconnected group of families, and also several New York families, especially the Lowe family of Brooklyn, which was a real discovery for me. There was this man called Abiel Abbott Lowe, who lived in Brooklyn Heights. My children went to school in a building that was right next to a church that they built, which in turn was very close to their residence, which is it's the most palatial residence in Brooklyn, and it was once on the market for $40 million, I think. So Abiel Abbott Lowe, he was a great pioneer of industry. And his sons went on to become extremely successful. One son was a very, very successful inventor and entrepreneur. Another son, Seth Lowe, became president of Columbia, then mayor of New York. And he endowed Columbia University with its most iconic building, which is actually named after his father, Abiel Abbott Lowe. So it's a building named after a great opium trader. And strangely, this history had been completely forgotten.
And you find this everywhere, right? You find this almost everywhere. You find this almost everywhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, every a major institution, old major institution in 19th century America. If you trace its roots back, it goes back to the opium trade, in one way or the other.
One name that really stood out to me was Warren Delano Jr. This is the grandfather or great grandfather, you'll correct me, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or ancestor.
Yes,
anyways.
well, Warren Delano Roosevelt was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather, and he was one of the biggest opium traders in Guangzhou in the 19th century. He made successive fortunes actually in Guangzhou. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt's money came entirely from his grandfather's side. His mother was the daughter of Warren Delano. So the Delanos are a very, very old family. I mean, they're not Mayflower, but immediately after. So they're a very old New England family, and there are many very famous people like Amasa Delano, who wrote a famous book on which Melville based his story, Benito Sereno. So they were a very old seafaring family. So it was almost normal for them to go into the opium trade. And they did, and they made masses of money out of it. Another family that grew immensely rich out of opium was a family that's iconic of American capitalism, the Forbes family. So the Forbeses, really, there were two Forbes brothers who made immense amounts of money out of opium. The thing to remember about these opium traders is that they were all very young. So they went out to Guangzhou often when they were teenagers. They were just sent by their families to learn the trade. So they went there as teenagers and they made immense fortunes and came back to the US. Some of them came back to the US as the richest men in America. And they had these vast fortunes. And apart from their own fortunes, their Chinese partners often entrusted them with money to invest. So they had this enormous amount of money to invest, and they became pioneers in every aspect of American industry. One industry into which they plowed an enormous quantity of money was the railways. The Forbes brothers were both big railway barons. There were others as well. So they plowed their money into the railways, and the early years of the railway industry here was largely financed by money that came back from China. This is the curious thing, that people know that Chinese labor was essential for American railways, especially in the West. What they don't know is that China provided the capital for the railways and, in a general sense, for the industrialization of America.
Through the opium trade.
Yeah.
I mean, I never thought, it's so obvious now, but that we have cities, well-known named cities, named after Chinese cities. I think of Canton, Ohio. If you're a sports fan, that's where you have the NFL Hall of Fame. I never thought of it as Canton.
Well, Canton was the sort of Anglice of Guangdong, because originally the Portuguese adapted it, and then Europeans knew Guangzhou as Canton. And it's really striking. There are twice as many cantons, twice as many cities in America named after Canton as are named after London. So there are innumerable cantons across America, and you'll find that a lot of them are actually very close to railway junctions. So these great magnates who are building these railroads, they're self-consciously, pointing in the direction of China. I mean, for them, it wasn't a secret where the money was coming from.
Oh, that's an HSBC. This is a British bank, but that's founded by opium traders.
Yes, it was actually founded in the 1880s or something, I think. They had a lot of big opium traders on their first board. It wasn't just, so many other major companies. For example, AIG, you remember the big insurance giant that collapsed in 2008, I think it was? That was also founded in Shanghai. I think, because Shanghai also became a big opium receiving port.
Were there ever people in the United States saying, "Hey, we should be concerned about what's happening here"?
Yes, there were many, many people. Even there were companies, American companies, trading in China that refused to trade in opium. Especially, there's one very famous company called Oliphant and Company. They were Quakers. They they refused to trade in opium because on moral grounds. So there were many Americans who refused to do that. There were many British who refused. But most of all, by the late 19th century, there was a global movement, that opposed the opium trade. And that became very, very powerful. And there were all kinds of religious groups, missionary groups, temperance groups, but most of all, women's movements that really came together to oppose the opium trade. And I think that's one of the few comforting things about the opium trade, one of the few lessons we can take away from it, that they actually succeeded eventually in curtailing the opium trade, and they were fighting entities that were incredibly powerful, probably more powerful than energy corporations are today, which is the European empires, the British Empire, Dutch Empire, French Empire, which were essentially the sponsors of the opium trade. But they fought them. They managed to curtail the opium trade. So in many ways, I think that the climate movement can take some heart from that. That it is possible to build an international coalition that can fight these very powerful entities.
We've talked about the devastating effects that the opium trade had on China. We talked about its devastating effect in more modern times on the United States. It was also devastating to India, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was devastating for many reasons. One is that there was a surge in opium addiction in India as well. In fact, it was a very major problem in India at the time of independence. But also, the peasants who were producing opium under British supervision in eastern India were doing so below cost. I mean, they were coerced into producing this opium, and they were losing money doing it. And it created all kinds of structures of underdevelopment whose effects can be traced to this day.
Inequality, right? Especially sort of between
inequality,
East and,
but
and
also,
West.
you see, what happened is that in order to supervise the cultivation of opium, the British created something called the Opium Department, which was a massive bureaucracy within a bureaucracy. And they had virtually dictatorial powers over a very large swath of the Indo-Gangetic Plain where opium was produced. And there they created these structures of surveillance and policing and so on, and coercion. It's effectively, you can see this is now the poorest, most underdeveloped part of India, even though historically it was the richest part of India. So we can see that its effects have lingered very profoundly. As we see, for example, the effects of plantation labor, slave labor, slavery as it was practiced in the Caribbean and in the American South, its long-term effects can still be seen, and that's the same for opium cultivation in India.
We've done shows both on the Mughal Empire as well as what would happen when the British then came in and the Mughal Empire starts to break up. But we never really talked about the role that opium played in that. But it sounds like the opium played a significant role because, as you said, I mean, the Mughal Empire was sort of the biggest, richest empire of its day.
But opium was not a significant factor in its economy. No, not at all.
No. Because but I'm saying for what would happen after.
Yes. I mean, once the British came, they made it a very, very significant. Essentially, the British Empire was sustained by its opium revenues. But this was not the case with the Mughals at all.
Yeah. No. I that's what I was trying to say. Is that sort of? But I guess what I was trying to get at is, did opium play a role then in the deterioration? Did it weaken the empire at all as the British came in, or was the Mughal Empire already in
Yeah, it was the other way
history at that
around. I mean,
time?
it was the weakness, it was the steady weakening of the Mughal Empire that made it possible for the British to, seize these opium-producing territories.
And then finally, how does the Sackler family play into this story? What was Arthur Sackler, and of course Sackler is where we get OxyContin. Was Arthur the Sackler involved in the opium trade in the early days?
No, as I remember, Arthur Sackler was not involved in opioids, but he became the marketer of Valium, and he was very successful at that, and that's what led to the expansion of the company. But again, I think it's important to note that the Sacklers have, in some sense, been made scapegoats for a much wider phenomenon. There were many other companies involved in this, so I'm glad that they have been, as it were, identified as the moving force behind this. But it's again important to note that they haven't actually lost their money. I mean, they managed to hang on to their money, most of it. But again, I think one of the things I would really like people to take away from my book is to recognize that Americans, white, Protestant, Yankee Americans, have had a close relationship, with the drug trade, because it's very disturbing now. You see that politicians constantly associate drugs with migrants, especially with Hispanic people from the South, with brown people of every kind. And there's no recognition of America's own responsibility in making this a major commodity of international trade.
Amitav Ghosh has been our guest. He has joined us to talk about the history of the opium trade. It is the subject of his new book. It's called Smoke and Ashes. Amitav Ghosh, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.